All right, so we can agree that species are there, right? We can agree that we intuitively know things are different than other things. How did they get that way? Even if we can't agree on what concept to use, biological, ecological, general lineage, evolutionary, whatever. Um, if we can't agree on what model to use, we can agree that things are different than each other. So we got to figure out what makes them different than each other. What's the processes that go on? We have a lot of species out there. And the reason we do is because sudden events, like a sudden change in the number of chromosomes due to a non-disjunction event in meiosis, that might create reproductive isolation. Something will stop an organism from successfully mating. Species are going to arise gradually in response to adapting to a specific ecological niche. If you put them in a place where they are isolated from other organisms, and they can mate freely within their own species, they will adapt to that specific ecological niche. The things on an island are going to be adapted to that island. That's exactly what Charles Darwin found. Eventually, reproductive isolation from the mainland unit, follows. So they could be independently on an island, evolving in their own population, adapting to that niche. They can still reproduce back on the mainland, but over time, they will lose that ability if they don't have immigration. This creating of new species is called cladogenesis. You take one population and split it into two. One bird split to two birds, two types of birds. And it can occur gradually, or it can occur very spontaneously. It's called cladogenesis. Clad is a group, so it's creating new groups. There are three possible mechanisms for this to occur: allopatric speciation, sympatric speciation, and parapatric speciation. I don't think your book talks about parapatric speciation, but I'm going to because I like to. Allopatric, parapatric, sympatric. Allopatric speciation is where some members of a population become isolated from the rest. Here we've got a population of bunnies. The bunnies split into two populations. At first, they look exactly like the original parent population. Let's say up on this northern part, you've got snow. Down here, it's all grassland and brown. Selection occurs. These white rabbits continue to breed with white rabbits. It's that white allele is selected for, and you constantly have white rabbits. In this other area that's been separated by this mountain range, slowly over time, you get brown rabbits selected for. So they've become isolated from each other, and that allows a specific set of alleles to rise or fall in frequency. Because remember, that's all evolution is, a change in allelic frequency. Here, the white allele is in high frequency. Here, the brown allele is in high frequency. You put them back together. Let's say the mountains, I don't know, they drill a hole through the mountains and the bunnies can get back and forth easily. They can start mating with each other again. What then will happen to the allelic frequencies once you have free flow between the populations? I am so proud of you, Nick. That was exactly right. The allelic frequencies will even out. They'll balance each other if these organisms can successfully reproduce. This is what happened in Panama. There is a fish called the porkfish. Do you guys know what? You guys know? Does it taste like pork? No. Yeah, sorry. I don't know why they call it a porkfish. It just is a porkfish. Okay, there's this word. This is one of the hardest words for me in the English language. It's isthmus. The Isthmus of Panama. Basically, a long time ago, Panama, right there, was underwater. That allowed the porkfish in the Pacific and the Pacific and the Atlantic to freely pass back and forth with each other. easily interbreeding. They were a single population. After the last ice age, or during the last ice age, the isthmus of Panama rose out of the sea as the sea levels retreated. That cut off the population of porkfish because porkfish can't, walk. They couldn't get from one side to the other. Now we have two distinct populations, one in the Pacific and one in the Atlantic. Humans came along. These fish were separated. They looked different. They acted different. They looked sort of similar, but they acted different. And we put in the Panama Canal. That created a waterway between the Atlantic and the Pacific and allowed for these two populations to meet up again. What ended up happening is, once they met up again, they were entirely different. They had different mating characteristics. They no longer recognized each other as the same species. They did not mate with each other. They weren't able to mate with each other. If you separate a species for long enough into two populations, oftentimes you're going to get reproductive isolation. Now, the cool part, though, about separating species out into different islands or different populations is that they do adapt very readily to the specific niches there. That leads to what's called adaptive radiation. You have a single ancestral species that, after it splits, adapts to its region and gains all these new characteristics. So you have a single ancestral species with a lot of descendants that look very different from each other. It radiates out. So we've got adaptive radiation that occurs with reproductive isolation. This is one major mechanism getting a lot of species. Darwin's finches are an example of adaptive radiation. With Darwin's finches, you had an original finch population that flew over, this is me flying, flew over to the Galapagos, landed there, and started adapting to an island. From there, over a few million years, they radiated out to other islands that had different resources. So now, those populations, you had a single ancestral species that looked like the mainland. It adapted to a new island, then adapted again. So all of these birds look very, very different based on their beak sizes, which are adapted to their individual niche. Adaptive radiation. When you have different groups coming together, when they start to engage each other, these different species, you might end up with what's called a hybrid zone. It's an area where two populations can freely interbreed. Wolves and coyote are different species, right? You have the gray wolf and the coyote. If you were to put them together, they will mate. They're going to produce a hybrid. Let's say we've got a population of gray wolves up here, a population of coyote down here. Right where that population meets, where they're not sharing resources, or where they're sharing resources, you find hybrids. In this case, between coyotes and gray wolves, you ended up producing what they called the red wolf. Do you guys ever heard of, like, we have to protect the red wolf? It turns out the endangered species, the red wolf, was never a species at all. It was a hybrid of the gray wolf and the coyote. We found that out through molecular testing. So all of the work that we did to save the red wolf, it never existed. But now we made them. Now we have a whole group of organisms that are hybrids between coyotes and wolves that we've decided is its own species. So hybrid zones form where two species that can interbreed. All right, so allopatric speciation occurs when you get some geographic barrier popping up and splitting a species. It could be a mountain, it could be a land bridge like the Panama, it could be a big lake forming, it could be you separate out lakes. Sympatric speciation occurs when there's no barrier to reproduction. The only barriers that come from reproduction are, there's no physical barriers. They're all behavioral or biological. In this case, we got two bunnies, white bunny, brown bunny. At first, this population can produce hybrids. There may be some societal thing as bunnies. There may be some behavioral mechanism that says these prefer to mate here, these prefer to mate here. What kind of mating is that called, where they prefer to mate with one group instead of another? Say that one more time. It is non-random. It's and that's a big thing with evolution, right? It encourages non-random mating encourages allelic frequencies to change. Specifically, it's called assortative mating, where you're mating with the homo-specific group. Homo means same. So the white bunnies mate with the white bunnies, the brown bunnies mate with the brown bunnies usually. On occasion, when they mix, you end up with a hybrid. But over time, if that assortative mating continues, these bunnies will no longer be able to produce offspring if you mated a white to a brown. It leads to reproductive isolation. So behavioral changes might cause sympatric speciation. They live in the same place, but they don't mate with each other. Think your life. There are plenty of people that you know of that you don't want to mate with based on the way they act. There will be eventually some people that would like to mate with them. So you will have two distinct cultures forming. One mechanism of sympatric isolation can occur when you get a change in the number of chromosomes, chromosome sets. You guys remember what haploid and diploid are from Bio 101, right? You have an N and a 2N. If meiosis goes wrong, if that process of producing gametes goes wrong, you may end up with a polyploid organism. In this case, they're triploid. They have 3 complete sets of chromosomes. These guys can't mate with these guys. The triploids can't mate with the diploids because the number of chromosomes don't match anymore. So if you were to, a good example of this is the strawberry. Do you guys ever look in your yard, like you let your grass grow because you forgot to cut it for, I don't know, a month and a half now, and you just hadn't had time, even though your wife tells you to? Yeah, cool. Okay, so in your yard, there might be small that look like strawberries. You guys ever seen those? They're like really tiny. Right. So those are actually strawberries. They're a Fragaria plant. Yeah, Fragaria plant. The strawberries you get in the store are octoploid strawberries. The ones in your yard are diploid strawberries. They cannot mate with each other, but they're both considered to be strawberries, just colloquially, because we call anything we eat a berry, even though they're not actually berries. They were formed when that diploid organism doubled the number of chromosomes, then doubled again. That created a whole new species. This is, I want to say this is allopolyploidy. Basically, 2 plants can have their own unique genomes. This one has 2 chromosomes, each with, and this one has 2 chromosomes, just for the sake of it. Totally different than these plants, completely different plants. Sometimes, in very rare circumstances, this first plant can produce a gamete that has its entire genome. The second plant can produce a gamete that has its entire genome. They fuse together to form an entirely new plant that is neither of the 2 parents. This new plant is a brand new species. It can't mate back with either parent, but it can mate with itself. Polyploidy leads to abrupt reproductive isolation. All right, so you can, as far as sympatric speciation, speciation occurring in one space, you can have it with just chromosome changes. You can also have it with behavioral changes. Here we got some fruit flies that mate on mangoes. Here we have fruit flies that mate on bananas. You find your mate on a mango, you're only ever going to find other mates that mate on mangoes. If you mate on a banana, you only ever find mates that mate on bananas. These flies are circling around in the exact same place. They're passing by each other all the time. Ecologically, they're in the exact same location. They can mate, but they don't because they don't go to the same clubs. Some prefer to mate on one type of fruit, others prefer to mate on the other type of fruit. That leads to speciation. They will eventually no longer be able to mate with each other. And finally, sexual selection. Sexual selection leads to homospecific choices. Here we've got cichlids from Lake Victoria in Africa. Is it in Africa? I want to say it is. So what ends up happening is among these, you've got P. pundamilia, P. nairi. You've got females will choose the males based on their coloration. Every single time. You'll always find P. pundamilla females mating with P. pundamilla males, P. nairi mating with P. nairi males. But it turns out that's only due to female choice. They can mate with each other. And in fact, if you were to shine an orange light onto these fish, the females will mate freely with either species, producing fertile offspring. In this case, sympatric speciation, these two fish are diverging, is due specifically to female mate choice. So allopatric speciation is going to occur when a barrier arises in the center of a population that splits it. Sympatric speciation occurs due to behaviors or sudden changes in chromosomes within a population. Final model, parapatric. With parapatric speciation, a new species evolves from a single geographically large and contiguous population. Let's say over here on the west coast, you've got giant brown bunnies. Over here on the east coast, you've got small white bunnies. West coast, big bunny. East coast, small bunny. They're different species. They cannot mate with each other. They look entirely different. They live in different regions. By every definition of a species, they are different. Does that make sense? All right, here's where it gets trickier. So we've got our west coast bunny mates with a bunny a little bit farther inland. They look similar. They can mate. They can produce fertile offspring. Are they the same species? Yes, according to every concept. So bunny A is the same as bunny B. Over here, white bunny can mate with slightly off-color bunny out in Ohio. They can successfully mate. They look similar. Are they the same species? Yes. So bunny A, B, C, D, E, F can mate with, nope, that's E, A, B, C. Dang it, that is an F. E, sorry, now I'm counting my backwards. E equals F. Okay. B and C can mate successfully. They look similar. They live in similar areas. Are they the same species? Yep. C and D live in similar areas. Look similar. The same species. D and E, similar areas. They look the same. They act the same. They can mate together. Same species. A equals B equals C equals D equals E equals F. So therefore, bunny A and bunny F are the same species according to our biological concept. But they can't mate with each other. They don't look alike. They don't live in the same area. This is where parapatric speciation comes into play. You get what's called a cline. Over a large area, you see small variation over time until you have two distinct species. There are bats living out in the west that are basically follow this model. Giant bats out in the west And we have our teeny tiny bats. We have the Corvus crow. Huge. I think it's huge out in the west, small out in the east, with variation all the way. We got here some green beetles very slowly transitioning over to blue beetles. Over a large area, you're going to get small changes from one extreme edge to the other extreme edge. You'll have one phenotype on one side, and it leads eventually to a different phenotype. And basically, the morphology and the genetic characteristics will allow us to classify these as different species just based on the sheer distance that they are apart and based on their reproductive isolation. So that's parapatry. You got allopatry, and you can see that I'm reinforcing there are these three big types. Allopatry, you get a barrier that erupts in the center of a population that separates them. Sympatry, you've got a single population that gets split basically by behaviors or by sudden changes in chromosomes, but the population remains intact. And parapatry, where you get two species just based on the fact that this is a huge geographic area and they will never mate and oftentimes can never mate. Allopatry, sympatry, if you were to take a parapatric species and wrap them around a geographic feature, you'll end up with what's known as a ring species. And these get kind of neat. Here we've got some salamanders all surrounding a desert. They can't live in the desert, too dry. Salamanders need a bit of water. So you've got a group here, this sort of brown group, can mate with the pink group, and they can mate with the orange group. But they are incapable of mating with the blues. All right, blue, though, can mate with pink and green, but not orange. Green can mate with orange and blue, but not pink. The species is forming a ring, and it loops back on itself. So the ring species results from a parapatric species looping itself around one geographic region.